pollution tax proposal, as well as why. Why this plan, why here in Vermont, and why now. So the presentations we have prepared will last for about a half an hour, I would say, and then we're going to have plenty of time for questions. So if you can hold your questions until the end, that would be helpful because we got a lot of just policy stuff to cover that will probably answer some of the questions you have to start eventually. Before I hand things off, though, I want to just tell you guys why I'm really motivated to work on this campaign. I lived here in the Upper Valley for a few years, including when Irene hit. And I moved to Vermont so my husband could actually work on this gorgeous farm many of you guys might know called Hurricane Flats. It's on the White River in South Royalton, and we were there when a storm that was, predicted to be really bad, but we were sitting in our apartment. It didn't seem that bad, and then we got a call from Geo just a mile down the road at the farm saying, you guys got to come down here and see what the river's doing. And by the time we got there 20 minutes later, he was in full emergency mode. The river had gone from bank full and was rising so quickly that we didn't even get all of the tractor equipment out of the fields. We had to abandon ship on the greenhouses and then realized that the 5 houses at the end of the field were right in the path of the redirected White River. So that day really made global warming go from an academic thing that I learned about in college to a real problem. And it's not just an environmental problem, but a human problem, a community problem, an economic problem, and one that we can and should do everything we can to stop more of. And these storms, the increasing frequency and destructiveness of storms is what global warming will look like here in New England. We've already seen that, just more precipitation. Gosh, anybody who has family in Boston is probably, they're a little tired of the precipitation these days, but we need to do much more in order to really move the ball forward on global warming, and that's what this campaign is all about. So we started about a year or so ago building a coalition because we knew that to really pass bold climate legislation, we needed more than just the usual suspects involved in the campaign. So we went to the low-income advocates, we went to the business community, we said, hey, we're looking at this plan to put a price on carbon pollution. It's something that we are really excited about and think we could actually have a winner for the economy and for low-income Vermonters as well. And so far we've gotten over 20 groups signed on to our core coalition in addition to other businesses and organizations endorsing the campaign. So some of them are listed here. Most notably, I think if any of you guys are involved in low-income weatherization, the community action agencies who are on the front lines of actually doing those low-income weatherization projects are on board with the campaign, helping us figure out how to make this policy work best for low-income Vermonters. Great. And as a lot of familiar faces in the climate and energy world probably know, we have some big goals here in Vermont for action on climate. And they're long-term goals like getting 90% of all of our energy from renewable sources by 2050. That's not just electricity, that's also transportation and heating. We've got a long way to go to get there. We're at, what, 17%? Give or take right now. 2050, it sounds like a long way away, but it's really not. It's not that long away. We've got a lot of work to do to get there. We have greenhouse gas reduction goals, 25% reduction from 90 levels by 2012. We did not meet that goal. And we're not on track to meet the further down the road goals unless we really step up our game to get there. And so this pollution tax is one of the most effective ways we can bridge the gap between our vision and the action needed to get there. So our speakers tonight are experts, I would say. Ben Walsh is VID00009's Climate and Energy Program Director, who has personally spent countless hours on research and polling and all sorts of different components to this policy. And the first speaker that I'm going to introduce is Janet Milne, a professor from Vermont Law School and the founder and director of the, and I need to read it so I get it right, Environmental Tax Policy Institute. And I hope that she'll tell you, although I haven't seen her slides, that a price on carbon pollution is not a radical idea. This is actually a type of policy that economists, experts, and climate experts throughout the world have said is a necessary and efficient way to address global warming. So just to give you a little example of the broad support, the spectrum of folks who support a carbon pollution tax in theory. We haven't asked them specifically about Vermont's version, but Hank Paulson, who was George W. Bush's Treasury Secretary, supports pricing carbon pollution. Bill McKibben, of course. Paul Krugman from more of the left flank, the New York Times economist. And even J. Wayne Leonard, who folks who have been active on the Vermont Yankee campaign might know was the Entergy CEO. So that's a pretty broad spectrum of voices, and I'm sure Janet will be able to tell you much more. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out on a cold night. It's a good vote of confidence for the concept that you made the effort to be here. I teach environmental taxation at Vermont Law School, so I haven't been actively involved in the development of this particular proposal that's coming out in Vermont, but I was asked to give you just a general introduction to carbon taxes to help set the framework for Ben's comments, which will take you into the heart of what you really want to find out about tonight. So I'm going to give you Carbon Taxes 101, the quick overview in 10 minutes of carbon tax theory and how it's been used around the world. But don't worry, there's no quiz at the end of the 10 minutes. So when we talk about environmental protection, usually in this country our first instinct is to think about regulation, because we've had a really rich history of federal and in Vermont state regulation. And so we have that instinct, but in fact there's a really interesting intersection between environmental protection and taxation. And it's that little intersection that we're going to be wandering into tonight. Taxation, I think, has tremendous potential because it sends out the price signals that just affect thousands and millions of decisions every day. Through the tax system, we're able to reach into the pockets of people's minds in ways that can be very effective. With taxation, there's a really simple formula. So this is not the complex stuff of green eye-shade accounting. It's a very basic idea for carbon taxes and really for all taxes. First, you find something you want to tax, your tax base. And then you figure out how much you want to tax it, the tax rate. You multiply the tax base times the tax rate, and you get lots of revenue, if it's a sufficiently large tax. So it's that revenue that's really the purpose of most tax systems. Government needs the revenue for its lifeblood, so it can do what it needs to do to protect our common interest. So carbon taxes are just like any other tax. We tax something at a certain rate and it generates revenue. But carbon taxes are different from most taxes in one respect, and that is that carbon taxes and other environmental taxes are designed to also have some kind of a behavioral effect. And this goes back to 1920 and a British professor named A.C. Pigou, P-I-G-O-U, who thought that our that generate costs for other people, for society. And those costs fall on all of the rest of us and aren't reflected in the price. So his idea was, let's have a tax that captures those social costs and puts it back on the activity or the product, so that then, as we're engaging in providing those services or products, we stop and think about what the real cost is to society and what the effect, and hopefully that will start affecting decision making. So that's the critical idea about a carbon tax. We want to take some of the social costs of greenhouse gas emissions and capture that and put it into a tax, so that as we're buying gas or heating our homes, we're thinking about what's the real cost of what we're doing. So that's the grand economic theory that lies beneath environmental taxes. And economists, as Liz said, are pretty unanimous that it's a good idea. But then we hit the reality of implementation. And the good news is that this is a concept that actually has been translated into reality. I'll talk primarily about British Columbia. They've done it, and they've done it really simply and in a way that I think shows you how you can design a carbon tax. So we have to find out what we're going to tax, the tax base. They taxed all of the fossil fuels that are consumed in British Columbia. This story started back in 2007 when the province set a greenhouse gas goal of reducing emissions by 33% by 2020. So they had to figure out how to get there, and the premier decided that one important way to do it would be a carbon tax. So early in 2008, he came out with a proposal to put a tax on all of the fossil fuels consumed in the province. That tax has very few exemptions. It exempts things like the fuel that goes into airplanes that are flying into another jurisdiction. That combustion is going to occur outside the province, so that makes sense. So very limited exceptions. In 2012, there's a slight exemption for some agricultural activities, but generally it covers about 70% of all the greenhouse gas emissions in the province. Carbon emissions, methane, and nitrous oxide from the combustion of fossil fuels. So really broad-based. And the tax rate. They started out with a tax rate of $10 a ton, and then raised it each year by $5, so now it's up to $30 a ton. That makes sense to phase it in so it's not too much of a shock to the economy, and people can get used to it and start adjusting their behavior over that 4-year period. Who pays the tax? They put the tax on a point which is technically called upstream. As soon as the fossil fuels enter the stream of commerce in British Columbia, at that point the tax is paid. Then you think, well, does that make sense? Because we're really trying to tax emissions. And it's all the end users that actually produce the emissions when the fuel is combusted. But what happens with carbon taxes is that there's a one-to-one correlation between the carbon content in the fuel and the ultimate emissions. So you can tax it early in the process, knowing that those emissions are actually going to be going out there at the end of the line. Taxing it early in the process makes it very easy for the tax administrators. Fewer taxpayers, easy to collect, and in British Columbia that cost gets passed down to the end users. Then, because it's a tax, you get the great question of what are you going to do with the money that you've just generated? In British Columbia now, it generates about $1.2 billion a year. It's a lot of cash. And with a carbon tax, if the tax itself is working well, hopefully behavior is changing. And so you don't necessarily have to use the revenue for any particular purpose. So the choice of how to use the revenue can be governed by politics, by policy. There are a whole set of ways you could use the revenue. What British Columbia did was say, we're going to raise the taxes on fossil fuels, the bads. We're going to use that revenue to reduce the tax rates on income. So we're going to tax the bads in order to give relief to some of the good things. And so it was revenue neutral. Everything that came in was used to reduce other tax rates. That had a couple of benefits. When you have a tax on fossil fuels, you're always going to worry about what's that going to do to lower income people, because you want to be concerned about whether people actually have the ability to pay the tax. So they directed a lot of the tax cuts to lower income taxpayers through reductions in the lower income tax rates and by giving refundable tax credits, so that people, even if people didn't pay taxes, they'd get a rebate back in the mail. And they set it up so that would happen 4 times a year, so people didn't have to wait till the end of the year just to get their tax relief. They also did tax relief for the business sector to avoid the issue of whether this was going to end up hurting the economy. So all of the revenue that came in is used to reduce other tax rates, and then they have a really interesting twist in the plot. People don't always believe government when government says this is going to be revenue neutral. So because they think, well, you say that now, but what happens next year? So they had a provision which says each year the finance minister tells us, has to give us a plan to say how this is going to be revenue neutral and make sure that everything that comes in actually doesn't stay in the public purse. How is that enforced? A 15% pay cut for the finance minister if he or she does not live up to that obligation. So actually how this is played out is that more is going out in tax cuts than in income, just in new tax revenue, to make sure that it's revenue neutral. So that's a quick introduction to British Columbia. It's comprehensive, it's simple, it went into effect quickly. It was announced in February of 2008. It went into effect in July of 2008 because it was building off of an existing tax system. In about 4 months after the tax was announced or went into effect, there was a bit of a revolt from the population. There was an Axe the Tax campaign in the next provincial election, but it survived. The premier who had announced it survived. And it's here to stay. It's been reviewed, and the government is committed to it. It's also been proven to be effective from an environmental point of view, and that's really why we want to do a carbon tax. So there's one study that over the first 4 years of the tax, greenhouse gas emissions have gone down by 17.4% in the province, and that's much more than for Canada as a whole. So it's actually 18.9% more than the province as a whole. So it's changing behavior. You could say, well, that's just British Columbia, but it's happening elsewhere. The Nordic countries have a long tradition of carbon taxes. So you see Sweden since 1991. Their tax rate for households and transportation is now 123 euros, and with the low exchange rates now, that's $139 per ton of carbon emissions, carbon dioxide emissions. So significant tax rate, and over the 20-year period that this has been in effect, the emissions have gone down by 20%. So it's working. Ireland, Switzerland, another example with a different kind of a feature. Its tax rate is adjusted to make sure that Switzerland is reaching its emissions reduction targets. So it started lower, now it's at 60 francs, which is roughly $60, and the government has announced that if there isn't more emissions reduction, it will go up in 2016 to 84 francs, roughly $80+. So it's kind of a self-correcting tax rate. Ireland is another situation, a carbon tax of 20 euros, and there's a carbon trading scheme in Europe, kind of like the regional greenhouse gas initiative here. And there, the carbon tax applies to the fuels that aren't covered by the cap and trade system. So So it's a logical complement. And I think one of the interesting things about that is that a lot of the political momentum came out of the fiscal crisis following the recession. The government needed money. And so the carbon tax was one way it could get it. Japan, a very small carbon tax, so it doesn't really change behavior, but it generates important revenue for green investments. So you see a lot of activity. There are other countries as well. Bernie Sanders has introduced a carbon pollution fee bill. Hasn't gone anywhere yet, but it's out there in the US. And in just one final slide, you can't read the fine print, but this is a graph done by the OECD. And it looks at the burden of taxes on energy here and on carbon dioxide there, and ranks the countries according to how much tax they're putting on energy and carbon dioxide. Where's the US? Right there. Next to last, compared to just next to last with Mexico being very last. So that gives you a graphic idea of how much we're not doing with carbon and energy pricing. And so then we leave it with the question of, what can Vermont do about that? Thank you.
On the dogs.
Let's hope not. Thank you very much, Janet. Before I started in on my presentation, I did want to say I feel very lucky to have Janet here in the room and providing that overview to you all. We're lucky enough in Vermont to have a couple of real nationally, internationally known experts on pollution pricing. Janet is, of course, one of them. John Erickson, who's at the Gun Institute up at the University of Vermont, who we've also been talking to about this policy, is another. And I think that's a real asset we have at the state and to this discussion that we're having in our state. So before I get into the nitty-gritty details of policy that we've been talking about and a bill that actually has been introduced at this point, I wanted to start by talking a little bit about our goals as a coalition. And again, this is a coalition that, of course, has a whole lot of environmental groups. It also has Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility and a growing number of low-income advocacy organizations. We have, we've got every few weeks a new member joining our coalition, and we also have a number of other supporters that will be, announcing in the near future who are sort of signing on as supporters but are less active members of the coalition. So our goals as a coalition are to substantially reduce Vermont's carbon pollution or greenhouse gas emissions, and actually, get to a place where our state could actually meet our state energy goals. We want to do that in a way that creates economic benefit for the state. And we want to do both of those things in a way that's actually equitable for all Vermonters. And in particular, we're very conscious of the particular needs of low-income Vermonters and wanting to make sure that any policy that we propose addresses those issues. So our plan, that our coalition is supporting, is to put a price on carbon pollution, to invest a portion of that money, 10%, in an energy independence fund that will help Vermonters cut their energy bills, cut their energy use, and actually transition away from dependence on fossil fuels. And use the other 90% to cut taxes that businesses and individuals in Vermont already pay. So I'm going to get into the bill momentarily, but I did want to briefly address the question of why Vermont. And that's, really speaks a lot to the goals that I just laid out. Were this a policy we didn't think could actually work for Vermont in Vermont, we wouldn't be proposing it. Of course, it'd be better if we did this at a national level or a regional level. That would be wonderful. Unfortunately, the guy running the Energy Committee in the U.S. Senate right now literally wrote the book on climate denial. I mean, it's called The Greatest Hoax. This is the guy in charge of deciding whether or not we take action on climate in the U.S. Senate. So, recognizing that climate action is not coming out of Washington, D.C. anytime soon, the question should we take action by ourselves at the state level? And from all the research that we've done, and we've contracted with a very reputable economic modeling firm, and I'll get to that a little bit later, but from all the research that we've done, we found that yes, we should do this as a state, and it would actually be good for our state were we to go to load, not just good for our environment. So put a price on carbon pollution, create an energy independence fund, and cut taxes for Vermonters. So that basic plan is embodied in a couple of bills. The one that I'm going to be talking about today is H412, an act relating to establishing a carbon pollution tax. So this was introduced by Representatives Mary Sullivan and David Dean. It's also been co-sponsored by Representative Bartholomew and Representative Maslin, who's here today. And 27 representatives in total have sponsored this legislation. So while we're just getting this conversation started, we really, there is a lot of interest in this in Montpelier. And one thing that I also want to recognize up front is we understand that this is a big question that the state is grappling with. I would be thrilled if we could be in a position where we started this conversation, we had our press conference launching this campaign, so to speak, in November, and just like BC, it was in place by July. That'd be great. Obviously, from a climate standpoint, that's what the physics dictate. That's the kind of timeline we need to be on. But this is a big policy. Our legislators rightfully want to take their time to understand the implications and really get it right and get all the details right. And so we expect that this would be a campaign that actually would be going on over a couple legislative sessions. So this bill is going to be taken up, we believe, in the House in the next few weeks, later this month. But we wouldn't expect it actually to be passed and signed into law until the second half of the legislative biennium in 2016. We want to move it as fast as we can within that constraint. So our plan, number one, put a price on carbon pollution. So a lot of this is going to sound really similar to what Janet just laid out in British Columbia. So it would be a tax on the carbon pollution created by fossil fuels. And it would be assessed at the fossil fuel distributor level, just like it is in British Columbia, because that's the simplest way to do it. You've got the fewest entities that are actually being taxed, and you end up spending less on overhead that way. Our proposal exempts electricity and would include every other fossil fuel sold in the state. So heating and transportation, industrial process fuels. It exempts electricity because electricity is actually already covered by the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. There's a price on carbon pollution on electricity in New England. We think the price in that program is too low, but that's a separate conversation. It's already got a price. We also already have other tools to deal with the electric sector, like Efficiency Vermont, and it's a very small portion of our carbon pollution in Vermont, about 5%. So for all those reasons, we're focusing on heating and transportation, which between the two of them are about 80% of our carbon pollution in Vermont. This proposal, this H412, this legislation, puts a price on carbon pollution starting at $10 in year one in 2018, ramping up $10 a year, ramping up just like they did in British Columbia at a different rate, but the idea is it gives the economy and individuals in the economy time to adjust until it gets to $100 a ton in 2027. And just to give you a sense of scale, that at $10 a ton, that's about 9 cents per gallon of gasoline or about 10 cents per gallon of heating oil. So that's point number one. Point number two is creating an energy independence fund. And point number three is cutting the taxes that Vermonters already pay. So let me go into a little bit of detail. And you can see right here, this is sort of the suite of tax cuts that we're talking about. I'll talk about each of them individually, but just that gives you a sense of it. And I should note that the pie charts I'm about to show you are rough estimates based on the best numbers I've got available to me. They're not, official estimates from the legislature's Joint Fiscal Office or anything like that. They're my best guesses based on what I know now. So, creating an energy independence fund. There are two things that we would propose that this 10% of the revenue be used for. First, low-income weatherization. This is a fantastic program that's saving low-income Vermonters a lot of money, cutting carbon pollution. It's once you fully fund that, or get additional money to low-income modernization, the other things that we would want to fund through this Energy Independence Fund are basically anything that can really make a dent in Vermonters' energy bills and Vermont's carbon pollution. So that is both in the heating and transportation arenas. So in heating, we've got a lot of solutions available to us today. We've got weatherization. You're spending something in the neighborhood of $8,000. You can cut your fuel bill by a quarter, your heating bill by a quarter. You've also got better heating technologies that are out there. Super efficient wood stoves or pellet boilers, great opportunities here in Vermont where we actually grow a lot of wood. Cold climate heat pumps, which is a newer technology to this climate, but also has an enormous opportunity to save Vermonters money and cut their fuel use and cut their carbon pollution. On the transportation side, we can use some of this money to get Vermonters into more fuel-efficient vehicles, recognizing we're a rural state and we're going to need to drive for the foreseeable future. But there are much more fuel-efficient vehicles out there already, and it's only getting better. We also think it makes sense to allocate some of this money to things like public transportation or park and rides, things that we already have a little bit of in Vermont, but we really could be doing a lot more on. And then the last thing is, to the extent that some of this money is being used to, perhaps, not right now, but down the road, get people into electric vehicles or to have those cold climate heat pumps, which is super efficient electric heat. Because some of this is electrifying transportation and heating, we think it makes sense probably to allocate some of this money to helping Vermonters and Vermont businesses go renewable in the electric sector as well. So, put a price on carbon pollution, create an energy independence fund to help Vermonters transition away from fossil fuels. And number 3, use the other 90% of the revenue to cut the taxes that Vermonters already pay. So there are 4 things that this bill proposes to do. Number 1, it would cut the sales tax. Over the first 3 years of the bill's implementation, it would cut the sales tax from 6% to 5%. Number 2, it would create an individual refundable tax credit. Again, similar to British Columbia, where every Vermont adult, every Vermont taxpayer would get a refundable tax credit. And refundable in this context basically means you get a check back at tax time. If you've already paid all of your taxes and you don't have no more tax liability, you get a check back. So every Vermonter is going to be getting money back under this proposal. Low-income Vermonters are going to get an additional rebate. And the idea, and I'll talk more about this in a second, is to get that money into their hands a little bit quicker, not just once a year. And then finally, a rebate that all employers would receive. And we looked at a couple of different options and a couple of different ways of doing this, but the current proposal is for every employer in the state, they would get a rebate based on the number of employees they have working for them. So if you have 10 full-time employees, you get 10 times as much as the one-person business who has 1 full-time employee. So just like the individual refundable tax credit, every employer is getting exactly the same amount of money back based on the number of employees they have. So a little bit more on the low-income aspect of this, because we recognize that this is something that we really need to get right in a carbon pollution tax policy. So the first thing to understand is that I'm not an expert in this arena, and most of our coalition partners in the environmental field aren't. I work in energy policy, so that's why we went to the community action agencies. That's why we were working with even other low-income advocacy organizations who aren't part of our coalition, because we understand we need to get this right. The second thing is just what exactly is in this bill. It takes, and these are rough numbers because of the way the sales tax cut works, it's about 12% of the total revenue of this policy would be an additional rebate to Vermonters that are up to 200% of the federal poverty level. So that's around basically the bottom 40% of wage earners in the state get an additional rebate under this proposal. And then the last thing, again, is that this would not just be a once-a-year thing. The idea is that it would be something that's monthly or research that we've done on this. So, like I said, when we started this conversation, the question that we had was, could we do, recognizing that a price on carbon pollution is such an essential step to take, that every economist, every climate policy expert says this is what you got to do if you're serious about dealing with climate change. Does it make sense to do it in Vermont? And so one of the pieces of information that was important for us to understand are what are the potential implications of doing this in Vermont to Vermonters, to Vermont's economy. So we reached out to Regional Economic Models, Inc. This is a nonpartisan economic modeling firm. This is what they do. They have incredibly complex software that takes all of the different things going on in an economy and how those interrelate. And they say, okay, so if you change this or that policy, what happens to the economy? And they do this in particular at the state level. So they actually have contracts with, in 47 out of the 50 states in the nation, and in Vermont, they're the go-to economic modelers for the state. They have a contract with the Legislative Joint Fiscal Office, for instance. So if the legislature is interested in taking a look at the potential implications of this, they'd go to the Legislative Joint Fiscal Office, and the Legislative Joint Fiscal Office would go to the folks at Reming. So we figured, let's just go straight to the source. So we worked with an economist there, and he crunched the numbers, and he said, okay, if we did this policy, and just full disclosure, the policy that they analyzed was very similar to, but not quite identical to, the policy that I just described as an H412. It didn't have a sales tax cut, and there was the low-income rebate worked a little bit. But it's pretty close, so these numbers are in the ballpark of what you'd see if you analyze this policy today. So what they found was a couple of things. These bottom two charts here are on the left, jobs, and on the right, gross state product. And the three lines you see are 50, the red one is $100 per ton, and the green one is $150 per ton of carbon pollution. So the middle line is actually what H412 does. Excuse me. And so we asked them to look at a few different scenarios because we wanted to get a sense of sort of what was the range of potential outcomes. And what they found was the higher the carbon pollution tax, the more jobs that you're going to have that you wouldn't have otherwise, the more jobs are created. And the more you see the state economy gain. And now I want to be clear here that, we're talking about 3,000 jobs in a state that's got about 450,000 workers, rough numbers. So we're talking about something that's, half to 3/4% of, on unemployment, for instance. So that's a marginal improvement. But for the folks that have those 3,000 jobs, I'd say that's a fairly important improvement. The other thing they found is that it would be a really substantial reduction in our carbon pollution. So at the highest level was, I believe, about a 40% reduction. So not the 75% that we have as a state goal, but it would certainly be the single largest step that we could take as a state to reduce our carbon pollution. We still need to do other things. We still need to have a renewable portfolio standard, have good net metering and electric efficiency policies, but this is the single biggest thing that we can do. And so one question that we asked ourselves, and you might be asking yourself right now, is why is this good for the economy? And in particular, why is a higher price on carbon pollution better for the economy than a lower price? And it boiled down at its simplest, the reason that this is good for the economy is it's fundamentally a policy that helps Vermont and Vermonters reduce the amount of money that we're spending on fossil fuels. You probably know Vermont doesn't produce any fossil fuels. And to be clear, I think that's great. I'm really glad that we're not blowing up our mountains to produce coal or fracking in farmers' fields to get gas. But one of the things that means is that we have very, very few jobs in fossil fuels. It's a little bit of, on the retail side. And so about roughly 8 out of every $10 we spend on fossil fuels goes directly out of the state's economy. It goes to ExxonMobil, or it goes to Saudi Arabia, or it goes to Wyoming. But it doesn't benefit the state. We're a net importer. So if we're reducing the amount of money we're spending on fossil fuels, that's money that Vermonters can spend on other things. They can spend on groceries, or they can spend on going out to So there were small gains across most sectors of the economy and big gains in a couple of sectors because of all of that weatherization, all that that's going on. So to wrap up, and I'm going to turn it over to you all, our goals are to make a big dent in Vermont's carbon pollution, benefit the economy, and do both of those things in a way that's good for all Vermonters. And we're going to do that by putting a price on carbon pollution, creating an energy independence fund to help Vermonters cut their fuel bills, and cutting taxes that Vermonters are paying. So we've got, I think, about 20 minutes for question and answer. And we've got to be out here, just so you know, at 8:30 sharp. Like, we need to be cleared from the parking lot. Let's get started.
If we put 10 cents on a gallon of gas and 10 cents on every fuel oil delivery per gallon, 10 cents on propane or whatever, altogether, do you have an idea of how much revenue that generates in a year?
Yeah. Well, I think it's on one of the slides, but basically it would be in year one about $60 million, and in year 10, which would be the peak of the revenue, about $500 million. So you might notice that that's not 10 times, 60 times 10, 600, not 500. And basically that's because if it's doing its job, you're shrinking your revenue base, your tax base.
Technically, it's $100 tax.
Yeah, at $100 in 2027, that was Remy's estimate. It would be about just over 500.
What low-income advocacy organizations have signed on as partners, and which ones have not as of yet?
Yeah. So the community action agencies, so Capstone Community Action, Central Vermont. Let me just pull up the slide. It's got most of them on it. Yeah, SEVCA, Southern Vermont, CDOEO up in Chittenden County. Sorry, this is taking a minute. So all of the weatherization agencies and which are sort of housed within the community action agencies have signed on. We've been speaking with Vermont Low Income Advocacy Council, VILIAC, COVE, the Committee of Vermont Elders, a number of others. Almost there. Yeah, here we go. So Capstone, SEVCA, Champlain Valley, Rock. So you can see a lot of them up there. It's not quite all of the ones that have signed on. On the ones that haven't signed on, we've been having conversations with, and mostly those conversations have been focused on how do we get this right? Like, what's the best delivery mechanism? Should it be 150% of poverty level or 200? So at this point, there are no, to the best of my knowledge, I think I know about it, no low-income advocacy organizations that are actually opposed to the policy. They just want to see it done right. Others?
So I'm wondering why you're focusing on a sales tax and a cash rather than property tax and income tax relief, which I think are probably bigger and more, in people's face
Yeah.
and concerning to most people.
Yeah. So the reason, so let me address that in a few parts. The reason not to do property tax, although believe me, politically it's really appealing, is it's a fairly progressive tax. The way it's, low-income individuals are less likely to own a lot of property, right? So if you're cutting it, you end up having to do a lot more on the low-income side. Whereas the sales tax is actually a fairly regressive tax to start with, so cutting it is a progressive tax cut. As far as income taxes, our feeling was it made more sense to do it. So it's actually delivered to the income tax. A refundable tax credit would functionally reduce your income taxes. Rather, we did that, or our proposal was to do that rather than cutting the income tax rate for the same basic reason. Income tax is a progressive tax, so if you're refunding the same amount to every individual, that is a more equitable way of doing it than cutting the rates. So that's the basic version. Yeah, that's the simplest way to explain how we got where we got. Oh, and one other thing on that.
quick thoughts for things to consider for possibly future revisions of the bill.
Yeah.
As the years go on, would be to maybe include spending some of the revenue on addressing readiness for the unavoidable climate change impacts that we have coming, which is really where the direct costs are coming from. And second, maybe something for those in the fossil fuel industry who accept the inevitable demise of it, help them transition for those who are willing to partake in that transition as opposed to just die with the industry.
Yeah.
One quick question and one maybe bigger one is, so the director of planning for our town, who is staff to the Energy Commission, I chair the Hartford Energy Commission, she's hard to get excited about this. I'm probably your biggest fan for this effort, and she's not yet on board. I tried to get her to come tonight. I don't see her here. But she's her biggest concerns, as you have shared, are with the low-income folks, and I'm wondering if there's some information feed that I can tap her into to keep track of how that effort's going and make sure that she's aware that that's at the forefront of this effort at this point to make sure that that gets done right, and maybe give her a means to contribute to that information. And maybe I'll save my other question for later.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have any sort of listserv that's dedicated specifically to low-income issues within it. I'd say, certainly have her keep on checking back on the website. We're trying to keep that fairly up to date. I know feels a little bit like a cop-out, but we just don't have the capacity to have like a listserv on each individual subsection of the policy. But, I mean, keep on coming to these things and stay in the loop, so you can keep me on the loop too. The other thing that I wanted to mention, so adaptation money, good idea, it's something we've talked about. I'm sure it's something that'll be a conversation that'll be had in the legislature. And then as far as money for fossil fuel dealers to transition to being more energy service providers, or weatherizing people's homes and things like that, I actually think the way that the Energy Independence Fund is written now, that would be a possibility. If they're really serious about it. I mean, I know some of them are partnering with Efficiency Vermont already, and most are kind of sticking to their traditional business, but not all, and some I think actually could benefit from that kind of thing. Also worth mentioning, biofuels would not be taxed under this proposal because they're not fossil fuels. They're not perfect, but they're substantially better than fossil fuels, and so to the extent that they're transitioning to biofuels, that would also be, this would benefit them in that way.
I'm curious about the relationship between the cost or price of carbon and behavioral change, and where you see scenarios where you start seeing really big changes.
I have a couple of thoughts on that, but Janet, probably you're better bet for it.
Yeah, no, shoot.
You would?
It's sort of so specific to the different sector. It's just kind of how many emissions come out of different sectors. So Vermont is heavily transportation, less electricity. So
Sure. So my 2 cents on that is, so there's a couple of things to know. One, REMI, the Regional Economic Modeling, so they have some assumptions that are fairly well researched on what the price elasticity, which is how quickly people move away from something when the price goes up, is. I don't remember what that number is off the top of my head, but it's a fairly slow transition for a couple of reasons. One, relative to goods that are less essential to day-to-day life than energy, it is it's just behavior take. There's less you can do than we've got a big tax on bananas, like I'm just going to buy apples instead. You need to get rent, right? That being said, as people are switching out cars, as people are switching out their heaters in their homes, just organically, there's going to be a lot of decisions about, well, maybe I'll get this car that's 3 miles per gallon better than this other car. And so a lot of little decisions like that add up over time. You also, there are some decisions that could be made, like carpooling or things like that. Carpooling. There are some decisions, even in a state like Vermont, that you can make. So that's number one. Number two is in British Columbia. understanding is they actually saw a much bigger reduction in fossil fuel use than they were expecting based on those kinds of price elasticity calculations. So I would say my gut, based on what I've seen in British Columbia research and what I've heard from Remy, is that the estimates in their model are perhaps a little bit cautious as far as how much they're assuming you're going to get from that. I know I didn't quite answer your question, but trying to get to it.
In terms of the British Columbia experience, there are a couple interesting facts that have come out of the studies. One is that one study found that the effect of the tax was 5 times what a comparable price increase would have been for the gas tax portion. So in other words, people reacted 5 times more aggressively just because the price increase was through a tax. And so I think that that's kind of an interesting example of just the force that delivering the tax message can have. And they also found that about 50% of the reduction in gasoline use came out of just driving less. And so there's kind of both the question of changing the technology and the way you do business, and then just being aware of how much you're consuming.
My trips. My goodness, all over the place. I think
Just sort of to follow along that idea and play the devil's advocate a bit, I read the Remy report today, and it strikes you right off the bat as this is sort of like free money, but it really isn't. Because the suppliers are going to raise their prices to cover that. What we're really doing is trying to change behavior and reduce our total consumption of fossil fuels and eventually get off of fossil fuels. And I'd like to know what happened maybe in British Columbia, but what you see as happening with the suppliers. Will they pass on the cost? And if they do, then we're just redirecting our money, from paying it to whatever, to going back into the state, and eventually it'll do us a lot of good. I mean, I'm all for this. And I also want to know how our neighbors will react. There are a lot of right here in the Connecticut Valley. There's a lot of fuel that comes out of New Hampshire that's delivered here, and how that will work. And what happens if the U.S. passes a carbon tax? How will that impact Vermont's carbon tax?
so a lot of questions back to one. Actually, repeat.
I read the report. It's a big one.
It is about 45 pages, lots of pretty pictures, so that helps you get through it. So as far as how much of the tax is going to be passed on, I mean, what the Remy report assumed was 100%, that every single dollar goes to the individual. I've heard people make compelling cases that it's something less than that, but I'm assuming 100%. I think that's what you've got to do when you're designing the policy. And so that's why so much of 100% of the money, minus some small portion for administrative costs, would go directly back to Vermonters, and 90% is just going straight back into their pockets through the, whichever mechanism, the refundable tax credit and the other ones. And so, yeah, it's absolutely not free money. It's increasing the tax on something we don't want and decreasing taxes on things that we do want, like income. As far as